Welcome to the Developmental, a podcast about the messy, beautiful ways grown-ups grow up. Here, we explore turning the science into the day-to-day practice of adult development in teams, homes, organizations, and life. Hello, friends, and welcome to a new episode of the Developmental. The conversation I'm about to invite you into is one that made my brain buzz and left me reflecting for days after we recorded it. It is exploring a very new space which has hardly been touched by systematic research, the intersection of neuroscience and vertical development. One of the limitations of adult development theories is that they have been traditionally grounded in psychology and have not had to date support from the hard science space, such as cognitive science or neuroscience. But that is slowly changing. And I'm joined today by a cognitive scientist who lives with a foot in both of these worlds, cognitive research and adult development, to explore what this intersection between these two fields might look like. Johan has a diverse background ranging from academia to military and security work. In the early years, he worked on the front line as a protection officer, security operator and consultant, as well as in the rehabilitation of young offenders. Later, he swung in an academic direction, lecturing and researching cognitive science and organizational psychology, while still keeping a foot in the high-stakes world training of various operators in stress management, threat and tactical security behavior, as well as high-risk conflict management. He has been leading an academic leadership program for senior non-com officers and Air Force pilots. Previously, Johan was an associate professor at UC South Denmark and is currently a consultant at Amara Collaboration and a scientific advisor at Shifting Horizons. Johan has been exploring the space between science, spirituality, and adult development for 2 decades and will continue to do so. His primary interest is in the interplay between human consciousness, biological systems, and physics. He lives in Denmark and enjoys his free time reading extensively, sea kayaking, running, self-defense, and, when there is time, exploring the wild. I've learned a lot from this conversation, and I was left with many more questions than I started with. So hopefully, depending on your feedback and your own curiosities, there might be a follow-up to this one. I'm looking forward to your thoughts once you listen to it. Hello, Johan, and welcome on the Developmental.
Hello.
This has been a bit of a dialogue in the making for a little while now, and I'm super excited that we actually get to explore what I believe is a virtually unexplored intersection between adult development and neuroscience. And you've stirred the pot quite a bit in our previous conversations, and there's so much I want to ask you and so much I want to learn. So very excited to have you here.
Thank you.
Johan, I'd love to start maybe by inviting you because you have a very interesting journey. You've come from cognitive science and from a research background, and you've immersed yourself in adult development, and now you're straddling these two worlds. So I'd love to invite you to share a bit of what that story is. How did your background as a very rational, data-driven scientist bring you to this point where you've come to be curious about this less tangible, let's say, evolution of consciousness and how adults develop and transform, and what has sparked that inquiry for you? What's the story?
So I have quite a mixed background. The funny thing is that I never really did well in school, and I didn't like school at all, which also made me kind of a misfit. And at the time, I didn't see that as a strength, but obviously it became quite a strength because I always looked at things from outside of the conventional. And when I went to high school, I didn't like it either. I just wanted to get out, and I actually wanted to join the military because I thought that there would be a place for me there because I didn't fit well into the mainstream. So, and I did actually join, and I spent some time there, and I also spent quite some years in security. But at the
What
same
can I ask you,
time,
what made you think that would be a better fit for a misfit? Like, how did that work?
I don't know, I had this romantic notion that all the misfits would join together outside of mainstream society in the military. Unfortunately, I discovered that military is just a different mainstream. I joined some training in America with some American special forces, and there I found some of what I was looking for, because in a way what I noticed was a lot of people in the special forces community were quite outside of the conventional. So there was something there. I found a kind of a tribe of people who didn't fit in and who were thinking a little bit differently, and so that was kind of interesting.
What does that mean for you? What does that mean for you to think a bit differently or to not fit into the mainstream? What does that look like? And how did it lead you to ending up studying how the brain works and how emotions work and all of that hardware that we carry around all day?
That's a very good question. Actually, I, for some odd reason, I got this idea. I was working with security consulting and also high risk protection stuff. And I kind of started to get curious. Have always been curious. And even though I didn't like school, I was always reading a lot of books about psychology, and I could use that in the work doing security consulting. I wanted to learn more, and of course then I would have to go to university, and I did that. And at the same time I was always almost working, sometimes even more than full time, in the security field. So that was actually a huge help, because I could actually somehow test some of the ideas. And I always had this sense that at that time, I didn't know anything about vertical development, but I had the sense that there's something about the way that we construct reality that must progress, not in a horizontal way, which means that we just build more and more knowledge about the world and everything is about information. I had this idea that no, it must be something else. It's not just about acquiring information. It
And not just
must
about a
be
volume of
no,
knowledge.
there must be
Mm-hmm.
something else. And that else was, of course, the way we construct reality. And I started to explore that at the university. I was studying system science and informatics and also cognitive science. And still, I couldn't really get what I needed, because most of the stuff was more about information. Everything was about information, a system. How does information work in a system? And when I finally graduated, I had this idea. Well, now I know a lot of stuff about the brain. So, and I started also to work as a consultant. And I was thinking I should just write a book about that stuff. And then I started, and I realized I know absolutely nothing about the brain, because even though I've been studying that stuff for several years, I realized that there's so much stuff I need to know, because I need to connect so many dots. And at some point, I was invited to work full time at a university, get into the tenure line, and I did that. But I didn't have enough time to do my own research, because I wanted to know everything. So I forced myself to spend all my
Mm-hmm.
weekends and all my spare time. And at some point I think they got really frustrated with me at the university, because I was interested in all that stuff, and they couldn't see the connection. Because then finally I stumbled upon vertical development and this notion of people developing in stages, and I wanted to connect the cognitive stuff with that, and they couldn't really see the purpose in that. And at that time, I also had my first child, and if I wanted to progress with that, I needed to go abroad, probably to America, or and that
What
wasn't an option at the time.
what was it for you? What do you think you were looking for? So you had learned a lot about how the brain works as
Yeah,
a mechanism, let's say. What
yeah,
did you feel? What was the question that was driving you? What was the question,
yeah.
or maybe there were several questions that were driving this search?
Mm. So I was very driven to somehow realize how people develop and how we gain a capacity to create different results, because being this kind of misfit, I kind of thought that conventional society, there was something wrong, something didn't work. And that was kind of my drive. I had this very strong drive to change things and to do something differently. And I kind of just saw everywhere that everything was the conventional way of understanding things in medicine, in sociology, in psychology, in cognitive. There was just something that didn't work out. But at the same time, I also knew that a lot of the stuff I've been working with and that a lot of the things that you actually can read about in the science literature also see things very differently. You just need to find the right space and the right perspective. And for instance, complex non-linear dynamics and stuff like that is a very different way of looking at organisms and also cognition, because suddenly you don't get a linear model, you get a circular model of complexity, and that's why I started to really be more interested in that stuff. And
what do you feel is the thing that you've learned that has maybe in a way challenged your own thinking, that has really sparked a different perspective for you? Because we were talking before we're going to start this recording about some stories that we still believe collectively about how our mind works, about how our rational and emotional aspects of our brain and our system work. And you were talking about how important it is to challenge some of these stories and how we could actually benefit and grow from challenging them. I'd love you to say a bit more about what was it that you learned? What is the story that you found that actually needs to be challenged? And how do we challenge it?
So first of all, the first thing I noticed was that every time I thought I got it all figured out, I noticed that a month or 2 months later, that picture shattered all over the place. And then I needed to start all over. And now I eventually reached a point where I could see that I could never really be sure about anything. And that was a great realization, because I suppose that's also, in a way, the way that we develop. If we have two fixed ideas about now I know, well, then we don't develop. And I could see that that was also the process with science. Most of us think that scientists are these people who always look for the new stuff, but no, most of the time a scientist has a hypothesis, and then the scientist would go and try to prove it. And sometimes they have to disprove it, but most of the time they believe in the hypothesis. And that's how we work. That's how the brain works. The brain is not this kind of, oh, I need to look for the new stuff. No, the brain always have an idea. It has a belief, and it wants to prove that belief, because if it can prove the belief, the world is predictable. And when the world is predictable, we can minimize uncertainty. And in a way, all biological life tries to minimize uncertainty, and uncertainty is unpredictability. So our whole, in a way, nervous system, our whole organism is designed or evolved to in a way, to minimize unpredictability. However, if we kind of notice that, well, that's fine. If you drive a car, it's pretty good, and it's pretty good that you get food and water and all that stuff. But if you want to develop a society, an organization, or even a human being, well, you need to break out of that predictive nature sometimes, because development happens beyond predictability, beyond the certain stuff. And I could see that makes sense for science, and it makes sense for human life in general. And that's what I found so immensely interesting, that in fact I shouldn't go about looking at the hard science stuff as if, well, I already know, I just need to fill out the gaps in a way, because that's how the brain works. It just wants to fill out the gaps all the time, because it wants to know. Because not knowing is not a good space to be in for a biological organism that needs to get what it needs. It needs heat, it needs water, it needs food, and it needs it now, and it needs it in the future. So unpredictability is not a good thing.
So in a sense, what you're saying, and I think that connects in such interesting ways with what we both know from developmental science, where we know that a new perspective is unlocked, or that internal growth occurs when human beings face what Jack Mezirow used to call disorienting dilemmas, where you just can't make sense of the world with your current
Yeah,
worldview.
exactly.
And what you're saying is that we are almost designed to avoid doing that. We're designed to not face or not lean into the disorienting dilemmas, because our brain is always looking for that safety, that predictability. So
Yeah.
how do you explain? I've always been fascinated ever since I started my own research, because, and maybe to give a bit of context to that question, 12, 13 years ago, when I started to inquire more into the value of self-awareness for leadership development, neuroscience was my first gateway into this. I read everything I could get my hands on to kind of try to unpack how can an understanding of this architecture that we carry around inform our decisions or our growth in some way. So now it feels almost like I'm coming back full circle to kind of reflect or stay curious about how does this. We know that there is something changing with people when they grow vertically, right? So something changes in the way they see the world, something changes in the way they behave. I know when we were talking about this, of only 2 studies that have teased out what possibly could happen with neural networks and the default mode network with people as they grow vertically. But what's your hypothesis? Because I imagine this has to be built in our system in some way for us to even be capable of this kind of transformative growth. And yet, what you're saying is our default is to not experience that. In a sense, it's like our default is to look for certainty, but nature also equipped us with this capacity to grow and transform when we are faced with uncertainty, when we are forced to work our way through those disorienting dilemmas. So what do you think, what do you think was nature's plan B in allowing us to even grow vertically in the first place? That's a very long-winded question. I hope it makes sense, and tell me if it doesn't.
It does. It does. It does. So the dilemma is always, in a way, what biologists would call explore and exploit. So should I explore something new, or should I just exploit what I have? Which means, should I stay or should I go? And that accounts for pretty much everything. Even a bacteria would somehow, now it's here and there's sugar and it's really good, I can stay here. But what happens when there's no sugar? I need to move. And it's kind of the same for a human being. You know, at some point I've been exploiting the same thing. For instance, I have had the same job for 25 years, but suddenly, you know, people don't use physical mail anymore. So now it's all digitized. So what now? I have to do something new. So the environment always forces change in a way. So, and in a way, so the funny thing is that at one end, we have this biological organism we call ourselves. On the other hand, we have this strange thing, what some scientists would call a can of worms. We call it consciousness, and we don't really know where it comes from, what it is. But you know, I might have a few ideas, and not everybody would like that. But in a way, the way I see it is that consciousness is a tool, but it's probably a tool that comes from somewhere else outside of the biological organism. And somehow we can master that tool. So first of all, the environment would push us sometimes to change. Something will happen, people around us change, financial crisis, whatever, something happens that forces people to change. But that's kind of an unconscious change. So at some point in our lives, we might start to realize, oh, holy moly, I actually changed all these times all throughout my life. And that just kind of happened to me. And then I start to notice this whole storyline. And in a way, I can become conscious of that. And in a way, at some point, I might start to realize, well, perhaps I could do that in a conscious way.
Perhaps there's more available to me and I can actually go look for it instead of have it happen to me.
Exactly. And that's just a fascinating thing that we humans can do. I don't know if other animals can do the same. Perhaps some can do, but I don't know. But at least humans can. So there's something really interesting about the way the architecture of the brain, and not just the architecture, but also the structure and the organization. And the structure and the organization changes. In fact, people would say, oh, if you do meditation, you can change your brain. Well, the brain changes all the time. When I wake up in the morning, the brain has changed so much during the day that when I go to sleep, the some mechanism in the brain has to figure out all the changes that happen during the day, which should we keep and which should we cut away during the night. So in fact, the brain changes all the time, but all of that is
neuroplasticity
unconscious.
is always at work, in a sense.
All the time. When I drink water, some synapse change, the strength in another synapse change, and so it happens all the time. But it's unconsciously. I'm not aware of it. I'm not paying attention to it.
Mm-hmm.
But the funny thing is that we could become aware of this. Some cognitive scientists, they would say that 95% of ourselves we cannot be conscious about, only 5%. I would say it doesn't look that way. 100% of what's going on inside my brain is totally unconscious to me. I could not know anything about what's going on, because how could I? I can't scan my brain, but I can be aware of my behavior and my thoughts and my feelings. And by being aware of that, I can derive something about my mechanisms,
So you can be aware of your experience, of your conscious experience, rather than the underlying mechanisms. Yeah. Honestly, I'm listening to you, Johan, and I've got like 20 questions floating in my brain. I mean, one thing that I'll say is, and we won't open that can of worms, but I know it's a fascinating one to even consider the two camps in consciousness research, in a sense. Or I think maybe one camp is much larger than the other, that supports the idea that consciousness is merely a byproduct of the brain. Although I've just seen this fascinating experiment recently where two theories of where consciousness might be in the brain and what the neural networks involved were compared and put head to head, and actually both turned out to be correct in a sense. So we're still in a deadlock. We don't know. So if it's a byproduct of the brain, it's still, what I got from that is we have no idea how it happens. And you're saying we could also consider consciousness is this mysterious tool that is not actually a byproduct of the brain, but it's something that is somehow from outside that we can learn how to hone in a way. But either way, what I'm also hearing, and please contradict me if I got this wrong, but what I'm hearing you say is growth is in essence an ongoing process of becoming ever more conscious of your own experience. And that includes your behaviors, your thoughts, your emotions. And the value of that for you is what? Why would people even go through the pain of becoming more conscious?
So first of all, the way I see it is that it's not that we become more conscious, because in a way, I think the most conscious creature in the human realm is a newborn baby, because they're 100% conscious of
fully
everything.
Present.
100%, just like boom, unless they're sleeping. So it's not about becoming more conscious, but it's becoming more conscious about what we are conscious about, in a way.
Like a meta-awareness.
And in a way, you could say, well, that's also what consciousness is about. Even some people would even say that even a single cell, a single celled organism would have to be somehow a little bit sentient to have this feedback loop of, oh, I shouldn't go there. That wasn't good. I should go that way. But I would like to start in another place, in another space, to map out why this would be a good idea. So what happens when a baby is born? So the baby just comes into the world, and it's not like it's a blank slate, but it's pretty blank, because human babies, they can't do much. They scream and they cry, but they it's not like a newborn gazelle that can move around within just a few minutes. They can't do that. So in a way, they need to develop so much, and their whole nervous system is very immature. The brain is very immature, and it needs to develop, which it does. And even some scientists would say that perhaps a baby brain can grow up to 1 million new synapses every damn second. That's a lot, you know. So it's obvious that what happens? Well, the baby is building a model in a way of the world, and that doesn't mean that it's not like a computer model. It's more a model of what might I expect from the world and what could I do with the world. So the baby learns motor skills, and they are stored as models, and it learns sensory skills. Oh, this might be a ball, and this ball is really funny, and if somebody throws it to me, it's really interesting. And then the baby starts to build this model, and as it grows, the model becomes more complex, it becomes bigger and bigger, and in the end it can predict all sorts of things. It can predict, if I say this to my mom, she's going to do that, and that's great, and if I don't say this, she's going to do something else, or if I do this to my brother or my sister, or that's this and that, and the model just grows and grows and grows. But in a way, it is still a model, which means that it's just a draft of reality. It's not the reality.
And I think there's not much reflection on the model itself, right? Because
not at all.
As we are young, we don't really necessarily, or most of the time we don't realize that we are, as Keegan would say, we are subject to our models of reality. We don't make them object that we can actually look and go, oh, is this model actually what I need, or should I tweak it a little bit?
And here's where my perspective comes in, because then you could ask, so what is that model for? And then we have to start from a very different space, which is early evolution. So one could ask, so why do we even have brains? Why did brains evolve? And I think the answer is that brains or central nervous systems evolved to create more complex behavior. And that's kind of it. Brains evolved for behavior, and they evolved for behavior to make sure that the metabolism of the body is well. So the whole purpose of having a brain is to make sure that the body is doing well and fine. And then we grow this predictive model of how to predict. First of all, the brain needs to predict needs of the body before they arise, and it needs to predict how to get it. Okay, I'm low on blood sugar. In fact, we're not low on blood sugar. When people say, oh, my blood sugar is low, it's just the brain that predicts that right now I should make my host, whatever that is, feel that the blood sugar is low, but it's not low at all. I just make my host feel that way, because then I know my host is going to go to the fridge and eat something before the blood sugar becomes low. Before it drops. A baby can't do that, but a baby will learn that from engaging with the environment and learning from parents and learning from other people. So in a way, we build this whole predictive model. But again, and then we come to believe that everything in the model is reality. For instance, a cat, the baby points, and then the mom or the dad says, oh, that's a cat. Okay, a cat. Now I know what a cat is. And then we categorize cat. Okay, that's a cat. But no, we don't really know. It's just a model. We just think we know. And then when we grow up, we learn about economy, we learn about KPI, strategy, this and that. But still, it's just models. It's not reality. It's just a constructed reality. And that whole system develops inside the brain and inside the body. And all of it is just to serve the body. So I learn about strategy, because if I become good at strategy, I can preserve my body well. And that's the brain's job. It's to make sure that the body is fine. And it's also, of course, to make sure that if you get a child, well, then you protect the child, and which is a very good thing, by the way, because that's how the species survives. But still, it's kind of a rigged game from the get-go. And unless we somehow discover that it's a rigged game from the beginning, then we'll just be servants to whatever metabolic needs the body has at a certain moment in time.
Yeah.
And then we build this whole story of culture, art, all of those things on top of that. And then we think we transcended nature. No, we didn't, not even close. In fact, nature just made a more sophisticated way of preserving the needs of the body.
What I find interesting and a bit confronting and challenging at the same time in what you're saying is that the paradox of this mechanism you're describing is that we got to a point where we are effectively, actively harming both nature and ourselves in the process of just blindly following the models that we have collectively learned to hold as truth, which is perhaps
Exactly.
where the value of a developmental perspective comes in, because the developmental perspective essentially invites people to disturb their current models, not to throw them
Exactly.
away automatically, not to label them as wrong, but to genuinely inquire into the validity of the model, or even entertain the idea that what I hold as absolute truth is a mental model, it's a construct. So
Yeah.
if I start to become curious, I'm starting to ask a lot of interesting questions. So how do you explain that paradox of what seems to be like a self-preservation impulse, in a sense, leads to self-destruction? So then how do we transcend that impulse? Where do you see the role of development in this story? How does that work from your perspective?
So in a way you could say that, so the especially a human brain, but also other animals, the brains are extremely adaptable. But again, they don't adapt to the present moment. Well, at least they try to do that, but they have to use the past to predict what's useful in the present moment. So we have this developmental history where we constructed our model in a way, which means that sometimes we try to adapt to something that might not be useful in the future. For instance, maybe I grew up in a violent, maybe my parents were violent, and then I get a violent partner in the future, and then you could say, well, that's pretty harmful, isn't it? But it's predictable. It's what I know. So it's predictable. I can predict, oh, if I do this, my husband or
Even when the
wife will
pattern is
be,
harmful, there's safety in
yeah,
the harmful pattern in a
it's
paradoxical way.
predictable. And the brain, in a way, is very important to know that the brain doesn't know anything. It's in a way, the brain is in a way you could say the brain's like an organization. Everybody doesn't know everything. So there are some people who know a little bit over here, some people know a little bit over here, and they need to interact and talk. And there's always also trillions of cells down here, and they also know their separate reality. So in a way, the whole organism is this collective intelligence. When we talk about collective intelligence, it's very important to know that we are collective intelligence, because we are not we're trillions of cells, and they are all in a way intelligent. And when they talk together, they just create more of it in a way. So even the brain tries to predict what might this be. Okay, so it might try to predict, oh, there's a big dog, and when I was a kid, a big dog bit me. So, that's not good. So we need to avoid a dog. So it predicts. Oh, I see fur. I see an ear coming around the corner. Oh, that's bad. And then my whole nervous system wakes up. However, it's also the same for every individual cell. It doesn't know, the brain cells don't know what's outside. They don't know what's in the body. They also need to predict. They also need to have their own models, which means that if I grow up in a violent relationship, my brain and all the cells, to some extent in my body, they come to believe that, well, that's the reality. That's the real reality. That's the right place to be. It hurts sometimes, but it's predictable. So the only way that we can change that is if we come to realize that, well, it's what I would like. I would like to be in a violent relationship. At least my brain and my body would like to be here, because that's all they know. But consciously, I can come to realize perhaps there's a reality on the other side of the fence that's better. Unfortunately, if I leave the violent relationship, I need to step out into uncertainty. And that's not pleasant, because that's very unpleasant. And there I will feel a lot of negative affect. And we call that anxiety, but in a way we could say it's everything. It's guilt, it's shame, it's whatever. It's negative feelings. I'm outside of the fence of what I like, and that's not nice. And that's how everything is in a way. Everything is in life is, am I inside the fence where everything is nice and cozy, or am I outside of the fence where it's unpredictable? But if I want to change an adaptive model that is not working, then I need to step outside of that fence, and that's not going to be. It's going to be. It's not going to feel well, and that's why I
Yeah.
also got very interested in your work.
I'd love to maybe just zoom in a bit on what you said, because I think there's a really important idea there that, in a sense, we are built to get used to even the pain of our current models. And there's some comfort in the familiar pain, whatever that familiar pain might look like for each of us. You gave the example of an unhealthy, dysfunctional relationship, but it could play out in the workplace. There will be, somebody was talking to me today about their people-pleasing patterns that they are so conscious of, that pattern does not bring them joy, but they keep finding themselves caught up in that pattern. And on the other side, to break the pattern, there's also discomfort, but this time it's a different type of discomfort. It's the pain and anxiety and fear of not having a model and not being able to predict what's going to happen next.
Exactly.
You were touching on where our kind of interests intersect, and we actually met in a workshop where we were talking about emotions and the role that they play in adult development. And for me, talking to you and hearing your perspective from an evolution and neuroscientific perspective on why that discomfort is actually good and welcome, because it's actually the threshold you have to cross for your brain to break its current predictive model, that made so much sense to me. And it explained why, when I ran the research and I found that the third of the people who had actually developed through that study were also the ones who somehow believed those unpleasant emotions held some value, and they were curious about them, which I now connect with the exploratory impulse you were describing. So they almost turned their exploration impulse towards those over the fence emotions, as you just called them, and that allowed them to open up their mind to a different way of seeing the whatever the context or the challenge was that they were in. And I'm wondering, on a practical level, because I know you also have a perspective around how action can drive internal change, and that's a bit different from a lot of mainstream thought that says, no, first we have to introspect and change the mindset and then we act. So I'm always interested in, the science is fascinating, but how can we turn it into practice? So how can we create or instill in people the capacity, the awareness, and then the capacity to really utilize those over the fence emotions, to really know or recognize the moment when the current model is no longer working, and also expect that it's not going to feel pleasant to get out of the current model? What role does acting before, in a way, introspecting, or doing both at the same time, what's the role of that? What's the role of action in personal transformation from your perspective?
In a way, it's kind of everything, at least from a brain perspective, because as I said before, brains did not evolve to think. I don't even know if I said that in that way, but brains didn't evolve to think. Brains evolved to behave, to control a body in order to move around the world. So everything is about, in a way, action. And also, when we think about perception is also about action, because even just to look at something, we actually need to move our heads to get different angles from what we are looking at, and the way that the optic nerve and the way that the visual cortex is constructed, it needs constant movement. And you would even see the eyes are moving around all the time. We call that in order to together. So everything is in a way about action. And then we would say, in a classical cognitive science notions, we would say that perception is here, action is here, and cognition is there,
You have to now describe which parts of your head did you just point to?
So the back of the head, the occipital lobe, the visual cortex, and then you have the frontal and the parietal, that's the action parts, the motor cortex, and then the frontal lobes, that's where all the important stuff is happening, and then we have the really bad stuff down below in the reptilian brain, and the frontal cortex tries to control that. So that's the classical old modular view of the brain. But that is an old view of the brain, because it doesn't really seem to work that way, because everything is in a way about getting around in the world. So everything is about getting the body around in the world.
So there's
and
an
getting it around.
interconnectedness. That separation is actually a false separation.
It's a whole system, and it has, in a way, the same purpose. And the funny thing is, you could even say that what we would call the reptilian brain, the brain stem and all that stuff, and the hindbrain. The funny thing is that you could actually say that the purpose of the prefrontal cortex is to serve the lower parts of the brain, because the brainstem is connected to the body. And that's, if the body doesn't do well, we're screwed. So the body has to do well. That's the first task. And the brain needs to attend to that all the time. And in order to make sure that the body is well, it needs to move. And there it has its models. It has its action models of, I can move my arm here, I can grab something, or even I can even extend that further into the world. I can use my mouth, which is also action. I move my mouth, I move my lungs. My lungs generate the air, muscles in my throat, the voice box muscles, and all of that is connected. It's even connected to the heart, because the heart needs to know that now I'm talking. And then it needs to pump more blood because the lungs are moving more. And so this whole entire system is connected. It's all about action. And to change those models of, if I do this, this will happen. For instance, if I do this, I can stay in a violent relationship. Or if I do this, my employees will behave in this way. And I like that. I want to control. Again, it's about predictability. So we need control. In fact, a lot of neuroscientists would say that the brain is a control system. It needs to control everything all the time, as much as possible.
That'll be what a lot of the leaders that I work with will talk about, not necessarily referring to their brain, but referring to themselves as needing to control.
And that's the brain, and that's why we need to recognize at some point in our development, we are more than our brain. We're in fact an entire system of consciousness, of the brain, of the body, and the world we live in. So in a way, we're much more than that. And we need to come to this realization that the brain has its job, and that is to take care of the body. But I don't need to always listen to that. Sometimes I could actually let go of control and step out and see what happens. It's maybe I'll be a little bit scared. I'll feel uncomfortable. But the uncomfortable signal is potential for new learning. And that's another
pains,
funny thing.
as I have come to call them. Growth pains in the brain, just like kids have growth pains in their limbs when they're growing up.
Exactly. And that's another funny thing about the brain, because, for instance, one of the learning molecules does, of course, a million other things, but one of the primary learning molecules in the brain is norepinephrine, noradrenaline. But noradrenaline is also a stress signaling hormone, stress neurotransmitter. And that's kind of funny. So if you want to learn something new, there's also a stress signal.
Some stress involved.
When you seek out novelty, you also need to be aware that sometimes it was in fact a tiger. Sometimes I actually need to go in a different way. So it makes sense for evolution or nature to connect stress and learning in a way.
That's fascinating. So it would almost, if you integrate that just this nugget that you've articulated now, this means that there's no way you can learn something new without expecting some level of stress or discomfort in the process, whatever it is that you are learning. Because that's
not really. No, but again, eventually we can come to experience. For instance, we put ourselves in all sorts of stressful situations. For instance, going to a theme park, driving the roller coaster, or trying to fly an airplane, jumping with a parachute. We do all sorts of stressful things, and which we sometimes even like. So stress doesn't have to be negative. But again, it's a model. It's just a model. It's not reality.
Yes. Just going to throw a thought in there that somebody was telling me recently, that somebody's stress is somebody else's excitement. So it feels like that's exactly what you're saying, that it is also a matter of how we interpret what we feel as stress.
For instance, here in Scandinavia, people love to swim in the wintertime, when we call that hormetic stress. Well, that's not toxic stress, that's positive stress. It's not super comfortable to immerse yourself in 0 degrees, that's Celsius. I'm sorry for the Fahrenheits out there, but 0 degrees Celsius, well, that's very cold water. But it's actually good for the body, for the mind. In a way, there's all sorts of negative things that we can come to appreciate and learn from. And
this somehow leads me to think of Robert Kagan's immunity to change process, and his, what I found such a powerful transformative lens that he puts on the idea of experimenting with challenging some of your big assumptions, which sounds like it's very much act to disturb your model of the world. So if that means lean into the difficult conversation that you've been avoiding having, or step up and speak up when your default model says sit down and shut up, or whatever it is that is a little bit risky. But I'd love you to speak a little bit about this idea of how do we organize these experiments, these actions that can actually lead us to expand our model of the world, and knowing that they're going to make us uncomfortable, but we're going to do them anyway. How do we find that sweet spot between challenging ourselves and not paralyzing ourselves? Because what I've also seen is when people are trying to take a risk that is too high, it's just way too threatening to experiment with whatever that action might be. We won't do it. We end up self-sabotaging. We end up pulling back and pulling back into the old model. So what would be a practical way almost to know how much discomfort is healthy and good, and when does it become maybe toxic or too much?
Definitely. And there's a very important distinction there, because it is really important to be aware that there's a reason why the brain and the body works the way it works. We have a whole stress system. Some people would call it also a threat system. And in a way, we could even say that it's one system, it's many systems. Most people would say that we have this lower part of the brain, and that's where all the bad stuff happens. And the amygdala, everybody talks about that controls fear, and that's very bad, and blah, blah, blah. Well, not really true. It plays a part, but the way I would put it is that the whole brain, in a way, is scared of the world that it can't predict. And the whole brain is there to make sure that we don't just barge into something, because that could be very dangerous. Because the more unpredictable something becomes, the more the potential for a negative surprise goes up, and that can be actually harmful, because we can become, that's what we would call, sometimes we call it a trauma. It's traumatizing. And in a way, a trauma from this perspective is something the brain remembers, together with the body, by the way, but it's something that it remembers that this is never going to happen to me again. I will never do this.
An unpredictable situation leading to enormous pain, something that you never want to experience again.
Yeah, exactly. And this system is also very much linked to what we would sometimes call the freeze mechanism, or when it gets really bad, we call it immobilized state. And that means that we come into a state and we can't move. We don't know what to do. We're just really stuck. So if we push ourselves too much, the brain has this fail-safe mechanism of just shutting down everything.
Like the handbrake, pulling the handbrake.
Yes, it's a serious handbrake in a way. Okay, you can't control anything anymore, so I'll take over from here now, and I'll just do. And then the whole, in a way, we just shut down. And people has felt that when somebody's yelling at them, or when somebody's getting really angry, or if two cars crash in front of us, we get this. And that's where all the trauma often happens. That's when we go into, we end up in these situations of immobilization. So it's very important to be very aware that too much is when we push it too much. And in fact, from my own perspective, it's the small things. Sometimes I could just do something as simple as, let's try to eat 20 minutes earlier or later than I used to. Simple stuff. Tomorrow, I'm going to ask my employees one question. I don't like to ask them questions because they're going to go crazy. But tomorrow, I'll just ask them.
They'll start sharing their thoughts. Don't want to hear that.
No, but I'm not going to ask 20 questions, just one question. And for instance, my old fear of the conventional also, if I was someplace and for instance, I had an experience a while back. I was in a foreign country and I was walking. I wanted to go to a beach, but I needed to cross some big rocks, small mountain, in fact. And then I almost came down there, and I wanted to go to a beach where there was no people because I knew this area is very secluded. But I could hear voices, and I was thinking, oh no, there's people. How bad can it be? And I feel this resistance. Oh no, I don't want to go there. People. But then I reminded myself, no, 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 no. Come on, you idiots. Just move. Just transgress the model. And then in fact, I did so. And there was some people, but they were at a boat, and 10 minutes later, they
And
were
they didn't
gone.
talk to you.
No, they didn't. And
The
in
two of
fact,
us would get along perfectly at a networking event, Johan.
exactly.
We would be the
Yeah.
two sitting on the side and going, oh, thank God I don't
Yeah.
have to speak to anybody else.
Exactly. And the worst part was I liked boats, and then I saw, oh, that's a cool boat. And in fact, I actually just wanted to talk with them, but they were too far out. Anyways, and that's the purpose of a lot of the affect the brain generates in the body, together with the body. The purpose is to control our behavior around the world.
Yeah.
Don't go there, don't go. But again, it's just the model. So
I
we
think
need to go there.
we need to go there, but then almost and also know what is that small step we can actually take.
Yeah.
And what I'm hearing you say is that there is a lot of value in the small steps that feel slightly uncomfortable, not
Yeah.
paralyzingly risky. And I think this
Yeah.
also challenges a big assumption that I'm seeing floating around in a lot of high performance environments in organizations where you and I
Yeah.
spend a lot of time in those environments. There's almost this all or nothing kind of mindset. If it's not big, it's not worth doing. And in a sense, what we're kind of talking about here is that, interestingly, our brain actually changes most reliably when we put ourselves through incremental discomfort. So the big things might actually be much less helpful than the many small things we can do to incrementally step outside of our comfort zone. So perhaps for the people listening, and I know there are a lot of coaches, a lot of facilitators, a lot of leaders tuning into these conversations, perhaps there's an invitation for reflection at this point to kind of go, what are some of the incremental steps that maybe you haven't taken because they were too small to count and you've been waiting for the big thing. And maybe it's time to actually take that small, uncomfortable step to disturb your current model in some way. And that step will potentially lead to another one and another one. And if there's a practical thing that people can take from this conversation, this might be one thing to play with, to challenge that all or nothing mindset.
Definitely. And also, I would also say that the brain is pretty smart in that way, that it really wants to make sure that we're okay. So sometimes we might think that now we're going to do something really crazy. But lo and behold, the brain will have its say. It will have its say 100%. And if you think otherwise, it's an illusion. It just is. Because this is not just a matter of doing something differently. It's a matter of your construction of reality. And if you go beyond your construction of reality, that's ego death. And that's not happening. It would take an entire life of hardcore development to reach a point where we can step outside of the ego. And when I say ego, I mean our current construction of reality. That's a lifetime of development. And it also means the death of me. So when people say those things, from my experience, and also what I've seen as a consultant, is that people would do crazy things, but it's still in a way within their models. They just don't see it that way. They think that, oh, this is really crazy stuff, but the brain will have its say. So the only way to transgress this, the only way to actually mitigate this, is to go slow and to make small steps, because it's not happening. It just isn't.
The handbrake will be pulled whether you choose it or not.
Yeah, and the thing is, the reason why we need to go slow is we need to explore a different reality. It's not just about doing something else. It's not just about let's go right instead of left. No, it's exploring a different version of reality. That's a big thing.
Is it correct to say that in doing that, in taking those incremental steps, we're actually giving our brain time to, one, see that nothing bad's happening, and to adjust its own model to this new reality that we're exploring. So then there's room for more, in a sense.
Exactly. Or else what will happen is that we get stressed without even knowing that we're stressed. In fact, that's some of the research I've done myself. because a lot of what I've actually done is about stress, because I find it so immensely fascinating. So a lot of people, if we ask them to rate how stressed they are, they would say, "Oh, I don't feel particularly stressed," and then we can actually measure their nervous systems and or EEG or something, and we can see, well, you're pretty stressed.
We don't even
But
realize.
we don't even realize it. And what that does is that it limits our capacity to have this, we call it a 100 feet view, to have the overview. And to get the overview, we also use our working memory. And one of the most, that's actually, I would, what you say, shout out to Amy Arnsten from Yale, fascinating neuroscientist. And she was working with, what's her name? I forgot. Anyways, it will come
I'll look
to me.
up these resources. There will be a lot of nerdy stuff in the notes of this show.
Yeah, Amy Arnsten's work. Patricia Goldman-Grakic, she was her mentor, and Amy has been continuing the work on working memory in the brain. And what they noticed very early on was that stress, this system is extremely sensitive to stress. Just a little bit of too much
stress. Our working
stress,
memory is extremely sensitive to stress.
It just blocks out because it's such a fascinating mechanism or a system which needs so many things to be in place. It works with a certain amount of norepinephrine, a certain amount of dopamine, and a certain amount of acetylcholine and glutamate and GABA, and all of those things needs to orchestrate in a very precise way. And stress just knocks that out. And simply by measuring the stress level of somebody, we can just predict that their working memory is not working very well at the moment. But if we ask them, so how do you feel? Oh, I'm not stressed at all. I'm doing really well.
Yep.
And then we tell people, let's go do this massive change in the organization. Let's go do this crazy stuff. And I can just say, well, your working memory is down to 10%. What is it you want to change? What is it you think you're going to do right now?
And which, if I remember correctly, there's a link between working memory and perspective taking, or our capacity to see the bigger picture, right, in the moment. So then if you're very stressed and your working memory is, if I understand that right, is down, your ability, if you're in a leadership context, let's say, to actually see what's going on, drops with that.
So the working memory is, in a way, it's the ability to have several concepts or perceptions, visualized in your mind at the same time. So you can you juggle with different things at the same time,
Yep.
So you're not, when you are in your working memory, you're not paying attention to what's outside. Now you're taking what is outside together with what was outside yesterday and the day before yesterday. So you kind of take all these things up, and then you look at it from a higher perspective, and as you say, from different angles, and so we can modulate. And in a way, that's perhaps what we would call thinking. We kind of simulate, I could do this, I could do that, or this is probably not a good idea. And when we're stressed, that system just doesn't work very well, and people are stressed all the time, in a way.
I really want to tease out something from what you just said now. I've just been spending some time with Valerie Livesay recently, who's done a lot of work on fallback in adult development, and the mechanisms by which we regress, although we do have this developmental capacity for a broader perspective, we regress into what she often calls our smaller selves. Yeah. So in a sense, what I'm hearing you say is this could potentially be the neuroscientific explanation of fallback, where when you are under stress, that capacity, that trained capacity to hold perspective actually narrows down to a point. And if I think of leaders that we are working with, they often say, I just lost sight. I just couldn't see anymore. And then we just revert to these black and white and right or wrong and narrower frames that we have outgrown developmentally, but we can't inhabit our broader perspective all the time. And that also invites for a bit of humbleness around glorifying the later stages, which is something that I've been banging on about lately, because I feel people get fascinated by adult development theories. And then from that to saying, oh, later stages are better, and there's something better and superior about people operating from those later stages, when in fact, we still have a brain, we still have our models of reality, we still have the stress and those moments of regression. So I think there's also an invitation to also acknowledge the fluidity of development. Curious if it resonates at all with your own experience of linking these two.
Definitely. So I also used to lecture in organizational psychology, and of course regression is a huge part of business psychology. And again, from a neuroscience perspective, the world is unpredictable. How can we create predictability? We need to narrow down the scope. Okay, I can only focus about this much at the time because all of that is unpredictable. So we need to find what's predictable. So it's and again, that's the thing we haven't talked much about, because the other part of the story, one thing is the brain and the body. The other thing is, what is it that the brain and the body is directed towards? And it's of course directed towards the world, which means that everything is in a way about action, and actions feels like something. That's where the emotional part comes in. But it's also actions in relation to the world. So the world or the environment is extremely important, because the brain in a way maps on to the environment, and we call that the affordance landscape. It's an old term from ecological psychology, that the environment, what is the world? Well, the world is a possibility for action. And it's very important to be very aware that, of course, our brains, when it looks at something, that I can engage with that, is going to create predictions, and those predictions will create an urge, and I want to engage with that. So the whole environment I'm in is going to create something. Either I want to withdraw from it, or I want to engage with it. And even though you're this super mature individual, your brain still works the same way. It hasn't changed at all. It's the purpose is still to make sure that the body gets what it needs and the body avoids what it doesn't need,
I'm happy you brought this up, because I've recently recorded an episode with John Lurie, who does a lot of work in systems change in organizations. So she's taken a very systemic perspective on adult development. And this is just one more reminder. It's never in isolation. I know we focused a lot on the individual and their brain and those links with individual development, but this reminder that, and I think you said it at some point in this conversation, we are systems within systems. We are a system ourselves, but then we are in this broader system, and there's always that interconnectedness happening. So never believe that you are changing your brain alone and in isolation, because that never is actually true.
No, and if I can elaborate a little bit, it's even so important that the way I and others would look at stress is not the presence of threat. Stress is the absence of safety, and safety is a function of the environment. So the brain and the body feel safe when the environment is in a specific way, which means that it's predictable, which also means that the environment is the holding space for the self. And what does that mean? The old psychologist Winnicott, he used this notion of the holding environment. The parent holds the environment for the children, and as they grow, then they're first they are dependent, then they're interdependent, and then they become independent. But the way I look at it is we never really become independent. We're always dependent on the holding environment, because the environment keeps the brain feeling safe in a way, and the body also. And we know this from studies of deprivation, sensory deprivation. If you put people into a space where they don't get any sensory stimuli, they become psychotic. So you always need to have possibilities of engagement. You always need to have sensory signals coming in all the time, or else you go mad. So in a way, the environment really, really holds the brain and the body. And of course, consciousness is a different animal there, or different, I don't know what you want to call it.
I'm just gonna maybe write this somewhere. I think this is just such an important thing. It's almost like a tagline, what you just said now, that stress is not the presence of threat, it's actually the absence of safety. So Johan, what's your maybe if this was my last question for you, because there's so much richness in this conversation and so much for me to reflect about, and I am really dying to see what thoughts and reflections it'll spark for people listening to this. What's your hope? What's that impulse that you started with, where you felt like you were outside and trying to see a different perspective? And I'm sensing it's still driving you in some way. What's your hope with all the work that you're doing, exploring these intersections? And I know you take a lot of this work in organizations and in your own work with leaders and teams and other contexts, but at the core for you at this stage in your life, as a father, as a consultant, as a researcher, as a human being in your own becoming, why is this important? Why does this whole work matter?
For me, my dream is that development is not just something that is good. Development would become the backbone of society, of communities, and not in individuals. Development should be important for the whole community, which means that the way I think we think of society today is that, you need to have fun, you need to get an education, you need to get a job, you need to get a career, and then you grow old, and then you can buy a boat and go on pension, if you live in the West at least. But for me, that's all nice and good and all that. But for me, the story I think would be much more beneficial to the world would be a story where, no, we live in a developing society. And I know Erik Erikson, of course, he was noticing these things in the North American native tribes. What is the difference between a developmental culture and a not so developmental culture? And he noticed that a few of the tribes, they were actually very developmental. It was the core of their whole society, which means that there's always somebody who is very old and very wise that everybody can go to, or there's a council of very old and wise people that everybody can go to. But again, it's not individuals, it's a collective, and everybody has a direction in a way that the child knows that one day I'll grow up and become more wise. And if I'm 35 or 45, I would still know that there is a direction, because I can just look at those. In the sense of
building more wisdom, not just achieving more outward.
Exactly. It's not about achieving, it's about creating a sustainable and healthy community. And which means that everything I do, to some extent, at some point in my life, is about giving back. And that's very meaningful. And we know that from the few cultures who actually live that way. So
gave me the goosebumps. And because for me, this question around what is wisdom and how can we grow wiser has been for a very, very long time the obsessive question that I'm still pursuing. So to hear you articulate that so beautifully, it's just hope giving, but also a bit terrifying, because there's always, for me, the fear in my mind, what if we don't make it? What if we don't grow up fast enough to kind of get to that place? But it also, I think, articulates why this developmental work is not just a nice to have, or not just a way to enhance performance in organizations. I think it does all of that. All the pragmatic reasons for which businesses are interested in these things that we've been talking about. But I think there's something beyond that could actually benefit the whole of society in a very profound way. So I'm deeply, deeply grateful for you and your work, Johan, and I'm happy we found each other and I get to nerd and learn. And I think this is the first conversation of what I hope will be many more to come. And at least one of the many more to come, I would love to record, because, as I said, I've got a whole list of unanswered questions and things that I'd love to explore, consciousness being top of the list, and thoughts on that. But
definitely.
How is it for you? I know you're very straight up in your how you go about things. How is this exploration for you?
Well, it's been really great. It's been really great. We have a common interest in adult development. And I really like it when I can connect all the hard science stuff to adult development. So that's, for me, it's just perfect in a way.
Thank you.
You have a lot of good questions. You are also, I can see, a good scientist always has more questions than answers. So I suppose that's what you are, yeah?
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. That's the ultimate compliment. I'm striving to be. I definitely think that research has just made me so much more humble about what I know and much more curious about the ocean of what I don't know, which is something you started with yourself. So I guess it's something that when you get into research, that's a gift that comes with it.
Yeah.
I think there will be lots of links that I would love to get from you on articles and resources and some of the researchers you brought into the conversation. And I'll be directing people your way because I'm pretty sure some questions will pop up as people listen to this. But thank you. It's been perfect. Awesome.
It has. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan. I was left with so many thoughts and reflections after this conversation. In no particular order, I'll just share a few of them with you and invite you to consider what your own insights have been. Disturb your reality in small steps is what I've heard Johan say, and take the action that is counterintuitive, that goes against your current model. Because left to its own devices, your brain is going to always search for predictability, for what has been known before, although the known space might actually be a painful space. But the known pain seems easier to bear than the unknown. So to be able to break that pattern, we might need to consciously step into discomfort. And as it turns out, discomfort in small doses is better than discomfort in large doses. I've also learned that stress is not the presence of threat, but the absence of safety. And that safety is a function of the environment, which means that the environment itself is a holding space for the self. We do not exist or develop in isolation, and what we call adult development is never a solo journey. We exist, we grow, we transform in relation to our environments. So how is your environment holding you at the moment? What are some maps that you have navigated life by and you might want to challenge? What I also resonated deeply with and felt very touched by was the hope that Johan expressed that one day development might become the backbone of our societies. That we might live in developmental cultures where wisdom building is as important, if not more so, than economic growth at all cost. And perhaps in bringing wisdom into the way we live and the way we interact with each other might support us in creating a more sustainable and healthy community and world, and might help us spend our lives with more purpose and meaning and more energy for giving back, not just taking from our environment. So many other reflections are percolating for me, but I'm very, very curious to hear yours. Whether you want to throw them in a comment underneath this podcast episode, write an email, or share on LinkedIn, you're welcome to express your thoughts. Contact me or Johan with your questions. And if you do want to listen to a second part of this podcast, we would love to know what you're interested in hearing more about, what we might focus on. If you have received this podcast as a share, do know that it is part of a larger space where all of the articles and the podcasts on vertical development from the Vertical Development Institute are hosted. It's our Substack space, which you can find at verticaldevelopment.education. I encourage you to subscribe to that space and receive all of these nuggets of reflection in your inbox every week. Till next time, my friends, I hope you stay conscious, curious, and wise. Thank you for listening.